Welcome to the Front Row, brought to you by the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Host of discussion, Mano, a senior corporate executive and public official, is in conversation with Ganaka Herath, partner McKinsey and Company. According to the National Economic Survey conducted by the Department of Census and Statistics of Sri Lanka, micro, small and medium enterprises account for 99% of all the businesses in the country and generate 2.3 million jobs. Thus, spurring SME sector growth could potentially result in accelerated economic growth. Ganaka Herath discusses the role SME could play in correcting the asymmetry in economic development, in addressing the income inequality and building an inclusive economy. Let's now listen to Ganaka Herath.
Two areas that I thought I'll sort of elaborate further, and hopefully you can add value to that. One area is that we were looking at and discussing the inability of the banking and the financial sector to raise significant funding in Sri Lanka for SMEs and also startup projects. In other words, the venture capital industry, though they have had many starts in the past, has really not blossomed. Any thoughts on that, and how do you see possible ways forward?
Sure. So interestingly, we've been looking at how to stimulate venture capital investments in fintechs in the UK and in wider Europe. I actually work across Africa as well, so looking at it in different geographic climates. And one thing that we found, and the key learning I think from, say, a place like Silicon Valley, is ecosystems. What constrains venture capitalists from investing is, one, they don't have a depth in the market in terms of targets that they're going after. So if there's one company that they should invest in, that's hardly a reason for a venture capitalist to develop an expertise in that sector to go into it. So where we see really successful venture capital investments is when we see an ecosystem of companies in a sector. So if I take fintechs, for example, if you can cluster it into an ecosystem that is, say, London-based or Manchester-based, what you then see happening around it is an ecosystem of venture capitalists coming into play and other supporting services. And that then develops a wider ecosystem that actually is quite symbiotic, in a sense. To do this, I think there are a couple of steps that can be taken. Again, using the fintech example, the UK has gone for this approach of bringing everything together in one place, just to say proximity leads to some level of symbiosis. And they've done that in the east of London. So East London is now the tech hub for the UK, and that was one of Prime Minister Cameron's, or the previous Prime Minister Cameron's, main aims, and that's been very successful. We're seeing a number of unicorns emerging from that investment. The other step is actually to think about your venture capitalists themselves, right? Because particularly in the more developing markets, what you find is venture capitalists are looking for better risk returns than you would have, let's say, in Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley, you're getting venture capitalists that are going wider. They're diversifying their risk by using lots of companies. When you don't have so many companies to pick from, you actually have to either reduce risk or think of different ways of diversifying risk. So also trying to help venture capitalists in thinking through what are the more innovative ways to risk diversify in a situation where there are less targets to go after.
SMEs have a perennial problem. One is, it is very difficult for them to raise capital, for even working capital, because our banking system, quite rightly, I suppose, is geared towards very risk-averse, asset-based lending, which they don't have. The number two situation is that the development banks in Sri Lanka, which was prevalent in the late 80s and 90s, the DFCC and the NDB, for instance, have now morphed themselves into fully fledged commercial banks. And there is this argument that for a new development bank, and there is a role that those development banks played in the late 80s and 90s, which resulted in many successful companies now. Unfortunately, that institutional framework is not there. Any comments on that and how the government should sort of look at this in the future?
Just to echo your first thought, I think symmetric growth between SMEs, mid-market and the large corporates is absolutely critical, right? One, just to make a more inclusive economy, but also to reduce the levels of inequality and then the kind of side effects of inequality such as insurrections that can come up. Interestingly, if you start looking at economies like Germany, all of their growth comes from their Mittelstand, right? Their mid-market, and in German Mittelstand is actually including the SMEs. We were very proud recently in the UK to say the UK SME and mid-market sector just became bigger than the Mittelstand. Growth has to come from there because that is where you've got the most amount of employment, and that is also where you see a lot of innovation happening. But that's just to agree with you. To answer your question, I think there's probably three things that need to happen. A more structural policy change to have a development bank is a good move and should definitely be a part of it. The commercial banks should also be encouraged to think of SME debt and lend more into that space. Because actually, again, I do this for a living, so I actually have I'm fortunate enough to see the portfolio views. If you, as a commercial bank, manage to lend well into the SME base, your risk diversification there is commensurate to what you would get in lending into the investment grade clients. So that encouragement and actually almost an understanding that you should be doing that, and that not only is it corporate social responsibility, but there is money to be made. So there is dual purpose. And the third is, I think you need to start opening up new funding sources. Now, we all know of Kickstarter and the more innovative ways of raising funds. That's one way to go, but crowdsourcing crowdfunding, I should say, for SMEs, not really being used in South Asia more generally. I think it's starting to happen in India a little bit. But even within that, starting to think about, you mentioned asset-backed lending, but how can you actually do better, more innovative factoring, more invoice finance, dynamic discounting? So a gamut of things need to change. A policy change around a development bank, the commercial banks understanding what the opportunity is and participating, and then becoming more innovative in terms of how SMEs get access to funds. All three of those things need to happen, I think.
Okay, thank you.
You were watching The Front Row, brought to you by the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. In today's episode, Ganaka Herath, partner McKinsey and Company, discussed the potential role the SME sector could play in building an inclusive economy. Thank you for watching The Front Row. The Ceylon Chamber of Commerce invites you to post your comments on Economy.lk Facebook page. Stay tuned for more insightful and informative episodes.